I chose to begin this show with this installation, which is really a tribute to Charlie. Now, putting rags on the wall of a gallery might seem like a strange way to pay tribute to someone, but this installation has a story behind it, of course. If you read the narrative of me and Charlie's meeting and my inheriting the studio, you know that Charlie was only my mentor for a year before he died. And not long after that, COVID hit. So I was alone in the studio a lot, and I came to know Charlie even after he was gone by spending so much time in this studio, which was really his most intimate space. It was the place where his imagination and who he was as a person really could be completely expressed. And you know, when someone dies, it's the things that they touched and handled every day that become so imbued with memory and really the loss of that person. And here I was in his studio reading his notebooks, using the kilns that he custom built. I drank from his mugs, I used the tools, and his old clothing was scattered everywhere. And I used it the same way he had for cleaning and drying and protecting glass and equipment. And even though they were just rags, you know, they were Charlie's clothes. And so as I spent all this time with Charlie alone in his studio, I talked to him. I would say, Charlie, what do I do about this? Or, Charlie, what is this for? And, you know, he answered me in his own way. Sometimes I'd be working on trying to figure something out, and then, I don't know, I would run across it somewhere, or I'd come into the studio and suddenly there would be a tool sitting out that I'm pretty sure I had never seen before. So I felt like we had this dialogue going on. And so I wanted to do something to kind of memorialize him in a way. So I decided to take his clothes, his socks and t-shirts and pillowcases, and cast them in glass to preserve these subtle feelings and thoughts that were really part of our exchange and our collaboration even after he was gone. I love casting fabric. I'm always really struck by the beauty that you capture when you sculpt fabric and then cast it in glass, because you can get all these subtleties of light and color, and they're encased somehow in the folds of the fabric. And so this whole installation grew from that initial impulse just to cast a few of Charlie's rags. And now it includes clothes and towels and things from both of us, as the studio has really become both of ours. And, you know, laundry, you can wash it, and the colors might even fade, but the thoughts and the feelings and ideas in those items of clothing and fabric, they're cast in glass, preserved forever from the erosion of time. So after Charlie died and I began to really excavate the studio to dig through all of the various things that he had left, I was just appalled because I found these beautiful cast glass sculptures, and they were just wrapped up in paper in crates in the dark. And I pull them out and just be stunned by how amazing they were. This one weighs 80 pounds, and it was months before I even got around to pulling it out and looking at it. And it was straight out of the mold. It had some sharp edges that had to be ground down and smoothed. And I was still learning to do that sort of work. And so after about 2 years, I finally felt that I had the cold working skills to attempt that terrifying to touch these pieces of Charlie's. So you can see here, though, I want to point out this technique that Charlie used. It's evident in many of his large castings. He used this technique that's fairly rare. He would cast this piece first with one layer in one color and cool it, and then cast the entire piece again with a second layer of glass in another color. And this is really a risky and time-consuming technique, but it results in these subtleties of color where, especially with these angular forms, where the light is coming through in different ways, and you get these gradations of the color that you just can't achieve in any other way. These are some of Charlie's first castings in his own studio. He had rented a small studio before he started the studio that I now use. So although they're basically flat pieces, they're considered cast because the glass was deliberately melted into this form. In the setup, you take pots, usually ceramic pots. They have holes in the bottom, and you place them above the kiln shelf, and each pot has different colors of glass, and you heat it until the glass drizzles through the holes and onto the shelf. That might sound fairly easy, but Charlie did it in such a way that he created these pictures. And to do this, he had to understand thoroughly the differences in viscosity in the different colors of glass. Different colors of glass, because they are chemically different, will flow at different rates. So those that flow quicker hit the shelf first. If you have a slower glass, it will end up on top of that first glass. So Charlie had to plan all that out, and he did. It's in his notebooks. In addition, Charlie dripped this colored glass onto a layer of clear glass, and he put that on top of a texturizing mix that was on the kiln shelf. So his hand is really in both the top and the underside of these pieces. Further down the gallery, you'll see a very large panel of circles, and that was created in the same way as the rest of these, but it was done later after Charlie had built his great big custom kilns that were big enough to accommodate a piece like that. This is one of Charlie's last castings. He did a series of 4 of these flags, and 3 of them are already owned by family and friends. They use different color schemes, but they all have this motif of a flag with the unbroken field of stars and then the bars which are broken. Now, I've been told that he deliberately chose green as the background color for this one so that it was not just about America. It's not a straight up red, white, and blue flag. And his commentary, according to his family, was really about the general state of politics. This was made in early 2016. Now, I'm going to go a little further with this, and since the stripes in our flag represent the 13 original states, maybe Charlie had in mind that the unity that originally drew those states together into a new country was broken. These 3 pieces and the one behind me in the center of the hallway are all part of the Shelter series, of which Charlie made more than 40. And all of them use this motif of a house shape that looks unstable in comparison to the solid shape around them. This is particularly true of the hollow houses, which have thick glass walls in this sturdy shape, but with an inner house that's off kilter. There's a lot of different interesting ways that Charlie used that contrast and the color of the glass to create this visual representation of domestic inside and out. Charlie had a great artist statement for one of the pieces of his, which is owned by the Holdens. Gorgeous piece. It was a first place winner in a national glass competition. And for that competition, Charlie wrote in his artist statement, "For me, the form of a shelter is a metaphor for many of our needs, hopes, and dreams. I imagine things solid, stable, and attainable. but in reality, they are shifting, tilting, and drifting out of reach. Because so many of Charlie's pieces were left unfinished, I'm in the strange predicament of deciding what to do with them. You can see on shelter 174 the little bubbles and overhangs of the glass that we call flashing. I kept those in this case because I think they go with the overall sense of turmoil in this piece. What looks like cracks is actually something called veiling, caused by microscopic bubbles when the glass was prepared for casting. In shelter 150, the surface was covered with a scum of devitrification, which is a breakdown of the glass that sometimes happens in casting. I had ground it down, but in order to polish it, I decided to put it in the kiln again. But this time I added something. It was a kind of collaboration. I added the background texture, which I feel makes the piece more dynamic, and those swirls add to the feeling of the house sinking. Charlie only signed a few pieces, and he titled none of them, so I created a catalog of his work, and that's where the numbers on these titles come from. So rather than deface all of this beautiful glass by scratching a signature directly into it, I've decided to instead offer a glass signature marker that can either be displayed alongside of a piece or, if the buyer prefers, can be adhered directly to the work. Both of these pieces are about the major life change that I went through that started in 2015. I woke up one morning in September with a premonition, I guess. I just suddenly knew that I wasn't going to live out the year. I just knew that I was going to die. And so I thought, wow, I better get going on this art stuff that I've been putting off. So I did something I'd been meaning to do, which is I draped myself in a black sheet and went to the community swimming pool. I set up my video camera and I jumped into the pool over and over and over. I could totally picture what I wanted to portray, the way that the figures would float and drift and how they would sit, how the reflections would work. So from that video, I pulled these still photos. I wasn't sure quite what to do in terms of actually presenting them. Then when I discovered the sandbed kiln at Charlie's, I made these coverings individually to go over each piece. The sequence here really portrays the process that I went through starting 2 months after this premonition, when my brain suddenly exploded. I had an aneurysm and it ruptured, filled my head with blood. I was airlifted to Emory and I had a lengthy brain surgery. I'm very lucky to be alive. I then had a long and slow recovery. And this piece came to me to represent this entire breakdown of myself and who I am that happened in connection with that aneurysm and all the things that came after it. So the recovery from my brain aneurysm was really slow. And I found that, as with some types of mental illness, brain injuries are really hard for other people to understand. One of the ways that I've described it is that it's as though you wake up with a new brain, and it works differently than your old brain, and that means all your memories and the way you think and feel is different. You are a different person, but you look the same, and no one can see that you've had this physical trauma, so they just assume that you're fine. Through some tremendous effort, you put on a mask and act normal because no one seems to know what you're talking about when you say your brain is different. On the plus side, after my aneurysm, I was able to do something I'd never done before, and that is to think with my hands. I could take pieces of glass and move them around and find compositions just by letting my fingers do the work instead of my brain. This piece is a different example of thinking with my hands. I had made some small wind chimes and very carefully laid them out with exact proportions, and they made this very pleasant tinkling sound. But I wanted to bring out different sounds that were heavier and more diverse than typical wind chimes. So I started cutting pieces of glass, kind of going by instinct, and I chose from a very limited set of glass for white and the wisps. And then I I crafted this story in my own wordless language, and I laid the pieces of glass within that story, and they took the form of the gestures I had made in the sand bed. And then I tied the pieces together so that they would strike each other differently depending on how the viewer moves them. It's a lot like how my brain works now. So this is a sound sculpture. You are welcome to play with it. You'll find that as you move the strands of glass, you can push them pretty hard. They will not break. Or just gently move them. You'll find that the variation in sounds is really considerable. So although this bowl would be classified as functional glass, it's really too pretty to use. It's also my favorite of the dozen or so bowls that Charlie made. This organic edge, the crackle texture, and that simple blue palette. It's like you can see something within him struggling to get out. So this piece is called Clear Soul. It's one in a series of mine I did called Breakthrough. I was thinking about the struggle that Charlie and me and many artists have to put our soul out there in a physical form for people to look at. That's why glass is such a great medium for expressions of the soul. As Charlie said, I choose glass for its predictable formal qualities, solidity, transparency, color. It allows me to work both on the surface and in the interior. But I also like glass for its surprises. Colors mix unpredictably. Highlights change as the day goes by. I'm never quite in as much control as I like to believe. So when I was learning to draw and paint, I spent hours and hours and hours doing gesture and contour drawings of human figures. So when I started making simplified figures in glass, I was really fascinated with how differently people who are looking at my art will interpret the human body. I one time had a friend who was from a culture where there's been a lot of war, and I asked him, I said, what do you think of these figures? And he said, oh, I think they're fighting. And I said, really? Because I designed them to be dancing. And I didn't mind that he saw it in a different way. It's simply his life experience that made him project that onto the figures. And so other people saw them as swimming or floating or flying. And that's really fun. That's an interesting thing to observe, is how people project onto these ambiguous figures. So these four demonstrate different techniques that you can use in glass. The figure in Remembrance of Wood was made with lost wax, which is a process also used in metal, where you create the form in wax, then you build a mold around it, and you melt the wax out. The tree was made with open face casting, which means that I made a clay model and then built a mold around that and pulled the clay out. In the piece Leaning In, that uses a hollow core casting method. The basic shape and the background are all designed in clay, and I build a mold around that. But to make the figure, which is in the center, I had to additionally make mold material in a positive shape that I could then include with the mold of the larger shape. So when the mold is removed, it leaves a void in the middle of the glass that is the shape of a figure. Because of how the light reflects and refracts through the glass, it gives the void an actual form, which is negative. It sounds really tricky, but it's not so hard. It is possible to learn, and it comes up with some really amazing effects. Finally, on the piece Into the Wind, I welded together steel rod to make the shape of a figure. And I did it in steel because I knew it can withstand the heat. And so I was then able to put the figure into the kiln and put a sheet of glass over it and heat the kiln to the right temperature for the right length of time. And that resulted in the glass draping over the steel rod. And when you stand it upright, it looks like a cape flying in the wind or a cover. I feel that that's a It's a good representation of how we hide ourselves or cover ourselves up when we are moving into difficult times in our lives. So I've had the good fortune to travel a lot, more than 40 countries, and I've worked in more than 20 in Asia and the Middle East. So when you spend that much time looking out of airplane windows, you really get engrossed in landforms. How and where people build their homes, grow their food, and what they choose to preserve. They're all fodder for art. Currents is about land, air, and water and how they interact, how the one flows over the other, how they mix together. One river, one sea is about how inevitably interconnected we are, which is even more obvious because of climate change. And at the end, we have along the Chattahoochee, which is a terrain map that I downloaded as a 3D file, printed it, and then made a mold from the 3D print. And this terrain map, I exaggerated slightly the vertical axes to express just how deeply the Chattahoochee River carves into Georgia's soul. There are a number of pieces here with unusual textures that would be difficult or impossible to achieve, except in a sand bed. Charlie took a workshop with an Australian glass artist, Warren Langley. He used a sand bed to make his architectural glass. So Charlie became really enamored with this idea, and so he designed and built this huge kiln that is devoted to making textures with sand. You can really capture so many things with sand that you can't do any other way. Gestures, impressions of objects. You can build up landforms. You can make unusual textures of all sorts. And you'll see that here with 44 forms, dissolution in 4 parts, kicking it, currents, thin air, birth of animus, and the unburied, the installation outside. I hold workshops on this several times a year, and there's 2 coming up in March. Owning a glass studio is exhilarating, exhausting, and expensive. I am under constant pressure to produce, market, teach, learn, and create. So I've learned how to flex under the weight without cracking or crumbling. My intention with this sculpture is to viscerally express the pain of all types of external stress and the posture required to resist it. I use sharp diagonal lines to characterize those external pressure surrounding a void that outlines my own silhouette. Although crouching and flinching, the figure is resistant with its curving lines of flexibility. It's a reminder that an arch is stronger from leaning inward, balanced by its own weight. Stress can feel as though a million pieces of glass are pushing into you. So I used 100 pounds of tempered glass shards to make this jagged form. I also chose to tack fuse, which is a lighter fuse of glass, rather than fully cast it, because I wanted to maintain the transparency and the texture of all those shards. The base, which you can't see, is wood. So the figure is in a wood slot covered with marble rocks and chips, and that creates this visual environment of the rugged obstacles over which we have to tread when pressure pushes us down. This piece was in the kiln for 3 weeks. Most of that time was slowly cooling. Because glass is a poor conductor of heat, on a thick, uneven piece like this, you have to go very slowly when you're cooling to ensure there's no areas where there's a big temperature difference between the inside and the out. If there is, the piece is stressed and it will crack. This one, it's plenty strong despite its appearance. The final piece here is the installation outside called The Unburied. This uses 9 markers of kiln-carved glass arranged in this grassy space to commemorate spirits of all who have died. For many years, Halloween was a really painful holiday for me because 3 different people that I loved all died around October 31st. So the markers, for me, symbolically depict how our souls, when we die, dissolve into the universe and we become part of the wind, the rain, the snow, and the earth. And glass, unlike marble tombstones, is of course transparent and it refracts the light. And that refraction extends life into the spirits. So when I was installing this, I was thinking of my parents, my dear friend Sarah, of course Charlie, and other people I was close to who have died. And so I invite anyone here who cares to, if you want to leave tributes for anyone you knew and loved at these markers, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much.